I imagine most Batman comic fans have an opinion about the Bruce Wayne, Selina Kyle, Batman Catwoman relationship. Should they even be in a relationship? Me personally, I say no. Batman is too much of a principled character. Bruce Wayne is too principled to go and start dating a criminal if he knows that they're a criminal. That's personally my take. Obviously, over the years, we have certainly seen the two characters flirt with each other. We've seen them date a little bit. Tom King took it to the next level. He wanted to have them married. Obviously, that didn't happen, but we are getting the Batman Catwoman, whatever that thing he's doing, where apparently they did get married and he dies and she's a criminal again. But not everybody agrees with Tom King's portrayal of the relationship. In fact, I would say he's the only person that has ever taken it this far. One person who disagrees is Scott Snyder. He talked about the relationship between Catwoman and Batman in his Substack newsletter. It got me thinking about Tom King's Batman run, and one of the reasons that really sunk it is the relationship between Catwoman and Batman themselves. So I searched out there. I found an article from Inverse talking about how Tom King introduced Batman to love or something stupid like that. So I'm going to talk about what Scott Snyder had to say in his newsletter, give a few thoughts there. And then there's just a few excerpts that I think really point out the flaws in Tom King's approach to Batman Catwoman in his Batman series and why this Batman Catwoman series is just awful. It's one of the worst comic series I've ever read in my life, and certainly not the payoff I think a lot of people expected in Batman Catwoman. First up, let's talk about Scott Snyder and what he had to say in his newsletter regarding the relationship. I thought that Zoe Kravitz was a great Catwoman. I will be totally honest, I'm not the biggest fan of Catwoman-Batman relationships. When it's done well, I'm always there for it, but I just feel like it falls into the same pattern of over and over again. They can't be together in the present. They get close, and then they fall apart. So it's more just that it's so telegraphed, but I thought they did a fantastic job with it and thought she was great. So I actually thought him and Catwoman was a huge plus. I really enjoyed it, even though I was bracing against it because generally those aren't my favorite Batman stories. That's just me, and that's just my version of Batman. I think there are a ton of versions of Batman where that's like bread and butter, and that's amazing. And if that's your bag, good on you, and that's your version of Batman, and I respect that. It's just not mine. I am personally right there with Scott Snyder. The will they, won't they, the hero falling in love with the criminal, the police officer falling in love with the criminal, those stories have been done for a very long time, and it's certainly very cliche writing trope throughout history. But I just don't think, in my mind, Batman and Catwoman mix, because Batman is so principled and he's so committed to the mission that I don't think he could break his principles, even if he fell in love with the criminal. Once he found out she was a criminal, I think that would be it, because that's just who Batman is. And his character, whether you think he's crazy or not, is really beyond reproach. He is who he says he is. He's not a pretender. He is all about justice. In that way, he's kind of like a Judge Dredd type of character where he doesn't bend his principles to the situation. He has principles, and he lays out his justice, and he does what he thinks is right in the moment. And every single moment, he kind of feels the same way. Not that he's a character that can't change or hasn't changed over the years, but his view of the mission and the way he sees criminals hasn't. And that's why I think the relationship obviously is doomed from the beginning, and it never felt right. And I think it was probably the major downfall of Tom King's Batman run itself. There's a reason that people still like Scott Snyder's Batman run. And when you look at the sales, like on the Amazon charts, you'll see Scott Snyder Batman still up there, even though it's been, what has it been, like 8 years since Scott Snyder regularly wrote Batman. It's still up there, and Tom King isn't, because his version of Batman and the stories he was telling were grounded in Batman, whereas Tom King's stories weren't grounded in Batman. There's certainly an audience for it. There's a Tom King audience. And I think a lot of people will come to Tom King's Batman if they didn't like Batman to begin with, or they thought that Batman had real issues, be like, this is the Batman I wanted. But Batman fans themselves, for the most part, have summarily rejected Tom King's version. I think there's several reasons for it. As I said, I went back to this article from Inverse.com called Tom King, the Writer Who Taught Batman How to Love. I think that is a hilarious title for a lot of reasons. This is an interview with Tom King. He gives plenty of quotes on what his inspirations for Batman and the relationship with Catwoman. He also gives a little bit of backstory about himself. I am not a psychologist. I'm not here to, and I'm certainly not qualified to break down Tom King's psychological issues, if he has any, or exactly where he's coming from. And these are deep-seated weird complexes and stuff like that. I'm just going to tell you what he said and my thoughts on it. and you can certainly come to your own conclusions. But I think it really lays out what a lot of the reasons why the relationship didn't work, and why a lot of the reasons over time his Batman run has essentially been rejected, and people turn to other Batman stories from the past as better stories. The first thing he talks about kind of is himself, and I think it gives you a little bit of a glimpse into where he's coming from, but also a lot of his misinterpretations of actually what he's writing. The article describes Tom King as a child of severely divorced parents who hated each other with every ounce of their being. King built his literary career on the power of compassionate and complicated love between super beings. He later went on to say, "I can't explain why I keep coming back to love. I guess you cannibalize life. The most important thing in my life is my relationship with my wife and children. So that becomes the heart of whatever series I'm on." I do not think that comes through in Tom King's writing. Most of the relationships, especially the main relationships in the titles, you go to A Strange Adventures, there's almost no love there, and their relationship is almost built on lies. There is a child in there that causes the friction in the end that causes the death of Adam Strange. I'm sorry if you haven't read that and I spoiled it. But when I read a Tom King story, and like especially this human target that we're getting right now, I think the version of love that we're seeing is very paper thin. It's not real love. It's almost lust, where it's love at first sight and all you want to do is screw. But then when you finally get to know each other, you find out how terrible the other person is. It's really strange. And there's a place for this stuff. There's certainly lots of these things in fiction. It's just weird when you have superheroes like this, because I know some people say, but it's nuance, Wes. And I was like, I think it's character assassination in a lot of the cases, which is one of the things that you will see tied to Tom King's writing style, especially with relationships. As far as being a child of severely divorced parents, I think a lot of people in our age demographic, our age, and I am of a similar age of Tom King. I think he's a couple years younger than me, or maybe we're the same age. It's right around there. I think a lot of our parents got divorced, and my parents didn't like each other very much either. But I've never wanted to tell a story like that. So I don't know that has a lot to do with where this comes from. But one of the things I don't see in Tom King comics is compassion that says the power of compassionate, complicated love between super beings. I almost never see compassion. I see a lot of really shallow, hollow characters that need to be fleshed out and need to feel real again. Because a lot of the stuff, I think, from the things that I've observed in my life and I've observed in comic books, none of it feels real when Tom King's writing it. And that's an honest assessment. He does go on to explain a few other things that I think really point out his deficiencies in writing Batman. Whatever you are at 12 is who you will be for the rest of your life. When I was 12, Batman Returns came out. I remember Michelle Pfeiffer. There's one line I keep coming back to in my head that, to me, defines all of Batman and Catwoman. They're dancing and they figure out their enemies. She asks, "Do we have to fight now?" That's your relationship in one line. "I'm in love with you. We have to fight, but can we finish the dance?" I remember being moved. I remember laughing. I think that was a comical line. I don't think you were supposed to be emotionally moved by it. And let's not forget that Tim Burton's Batman isn't exactly flush with Batman lore. He kind of took elements of Batman, the Batman story and the mythos and stuff, and then reshaped them around the story that he wanted to tell. Now, certainly we have seen Bruce Wayne and Selina Kyle in the past in comic books, but I don't think that any of the comic book writers ever really intended them to be together. It was supposed to just be a complex relationship that could never be, that provided, some conflict within the story. I feel like maybe he's basing too much of his understanding of Batman and Catwoman on that movie, Batman Returns, which isn't exactly a really true interpretation of Batman, at least the comic book character. As far as whatever you are when you're 12, that's who you are forever. I could not disagree with that more. Like, the person that I was when I was 12, I was a child. I like childish things. Now, I still enjoy childish things. I enjoy comic books. I like movies and stuff like that. But the man I am today is almost unrecognizable from the man I was 5 years ago when I was 39. Certainly completely unrecognizable in the way that I look at life and I deal with stress and things like that from when I was 34 years old, 10 years ago. And to think about me being the same person I was when I was 12, there are certainly pieces of me that are there from the time I was 12. And there are things that I like from the time I was 12 that are still with me and I still like them and stuff like that. But the emotional progress in my life and the man that I am today would be impossible if I was still the person I was when I was 12. I don't understand that line at all. There might be shades of you when you were 12, or an idea of maybe who you could become depending on how things went when you were 12 years old. But between the ages of 12 and in your mid 40s, like Tom King and I are, like, that is one of the oddest statements I've ever heard in my life, and I couldn't disagree with it more. Next, he says, Batman lives by one ethos: fight criminals. And he falls in love with the criminal. And then he says, in Batman's origin story, the criminal reaches for pearls, and Batman ends up falling for someone whose sole purpose is to steal jewelry. That's some fucked up Freudian shit, man. While I do agree that's some fucked up Freudian shit, that's not like Batman's fucked up Freudian shit. That's your story. You're the one that wrote it. You're the one that is projecting those weird behaviors on the character. No one's ever really done this before. They've certainly had them flirt. They certainly dated, but nobody had them like falling in love and fucking every night and getting married and having children and living happily ever after together. Tom King wrote that. So does that weird Freudian shit really say anything about Batman, the creation by Bill Finger and Bob Kane, or does it say something about Tom King? Because it's his story. It's his interpretation of Batman. No one's ever had this interpretation or tried to tell this story before. I say it says more about Tom King personally. These are the final two quotes I wanted to talk about. He says, Batman sees no use for love. That gets in the way of his vow. When Batman falls for Catwoman, he does it reluctantly. Every instinct tells him to run. Later, he describes the relationship as an examination of two very different people. One person who doesn't change. When his parents were killed, he became Batman and stayed that way. Catwoman has a diverse life. She's turned from villain to good guy. Who you are changes based on what you're made of. First of all, I definitely disagree that Batman sees no use for love. He certainly loved his parents, and while he is driven by vengeance, I do agree with what Kyle Higgins said. The difference between Batman and Nightwing is Batman's kind of driven by vengeance, whereas Nightwing is driven by love. So I don't think Batman's mission is inherently a loving act, but it's certainly driven by love of his parents and the love that he lost at a very young age. So that is certainly a component in that. And I definitely get the feeling that he loves Gotham with all of his heart. He's literally putting his life on the line to go out there and protect the citizens. Don't forget, Batman is a very reactive character. He doesn't go out there and stop crime before it starts. He goes out there and sees what happens, and he provides justice to the victims because they're Gothamites, and he can see himself in the victims that are there today. And there is an amount of love there for him to go out there and protect even people he doesn't know. That, to me, is an act of love. And he certainly loves Alfred, and he loves his Robins. When Jason Todd dies, he almost has a mental breakdown. He almost can't be Batman anymore. And it takes Tim Drake coming in there and explaining to him that it wasn't his fault. There is more life after this, and you have to keep being a hero, for Jason Todd, that he finally kind of gets it together. But you don't have that kind of mental breakdown without love in your life. Do I think Batman Bruce Wayne is destined to fall in love and to live out the rest of his life in happiness? I would like to see that for the character. Certainly DC Comics will never let it happen because you still need Bruce Wayne as Batman. But it doesn't really fit in with the character either. I understand that he has his mission. And his mission is so important because of what happened to him and the love that was taken away when his father and mother were killed. But that doesn't mean he doesn't have love. And it certainly doesn't mean he can't have love for another person or a woman and be in that type of relationship. I think the way that Batman is portrayed that way is more of a statement about DC Comics not wanting him to get old or be happy with his life. I also fundamentally disagree, and I think that Tom King doesn't get the character of Bruce Wayne and Batman if he thinks that when Bruce Wayne witnessed his parents die, Batman was bored and he never changed. He's the same little kid that witnessed his parents brutally murdered, and he's never emotionally evolved as a character or a man over time. That is certainly not true. I mean, I could go over the history of Batman and why it isn't true, but if you're a Batman fan, you kind of get where I'm coming from. But I think, running just down these quotes themselves, and there are a lot of interviews out there of Tom King talking about his Batman run, you can see why the relationship between Catwoman and Batman never really worked. I don't think he actually gets the character of Batman, and I don't think he gets how people evolve and grow just in real life. So when you put those kind of things together, and his insistence throughout the story that Selina Kyle Catwoman is like a more fortified character in her principles and beliefs, and like an emotionally more stable character than Batman, where it all kind of falls apart because there's several things that just aren't working on several levels. He thinks Batman is the same guy he was when he was 12, because I guess he is. He doesn't think Batman can have love in his life. Batman's mission is an expression of love, really. It's driven by vengeance, but it's for love of his parents and the love of his city that he's doing it. And I think you see all these things come through, and you end up getting the Batman run that just absolutely falls apart leading up into issue number 50 and certainly after that. And this terrible Batman Catwoman run that nobody should be reading for anything but the Clayman art. While I do agree with Scott Snyder that I prefer to see the characters not together, I think you can put the characters together and you could potentially have them fall in love and be together for the rest of their lives. But you couldn't do it with Tom King because he's just a really bad fit for Batman himself. Another reason Tom King's Batman fails so terribly, and really all of his work at DC, is his use of literary trauma. That is a writing trope. That is a technique that you can use and can be very powerful. And his misunderstanding how to use that technique is really one of his downfalls as a writer. I had a full conversation about that, talking about the technique of literary trauma and why it doesn't work. Definitely check this one out. It's a shorter video. It's only about 60 minutes, but really give you some insight on where Tom King really failed here.